button now. So we will be recording this event, and it will lately be posted on the Media, Film and Communications program YouTube as well. And I've got all your emails, so I'll send you through that link once it's live. Okay, so we are delighted to have with us today Isabel Millar from London and England, and Daniel Tutt, who's based in Washington, DC, and Brett Nichols, who's my colleague in the Media, Film and Communications program here at Ottago in Dunedin. As I said, I'll be muting myself, so hopefully we get rid of the bing bongs. Now, so first up, I want to introduce Isabel, who'll be kicking off discussions today. So Isabel Millar is a philosopher and psychoanalytic theorist from London. She is the author of The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, which is forthcoming in the really, truly wonderful Palgrave Lacan series. And I see lots of fellow Palgrave Lacanians in the room today. So without further ado, I welcome Isabel. Please take the Zoom stage.
Thank you, Rosie. Thanks for setting this up. I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody's responses. I'm gonna talk for about 10 minutes. I've just prepared a few remarks, so I don't go off into a waffle. Okay, so apart from his unique and masterful stitching of archive footage, along with his inimitable selection of eclectic and haunting music, now so recognizable as to verge on parody, I think the films of Adam Curtis all share another important distinguishing feature, which is his technique of showing how the media make very complex things appear very simple in order to fit a coherent narrative. This Curtis sees as reaching its peak after the Cold War and finally crumbling into absurdity with the atrocities of the Rwandan Civil War in 1994, where no one could decide anymore who were the good guys, hence dissolving into what he termed "oh dearism," a sort of pervasive, helpless despair at the mindless cruelty of human beings, which he says is like living in the mind of a depressed hippie. His contention is usually that this is the wrong thing to do, as it stops us from problematizing political conflict, and by simplifying these stories, we lose their true meaning. However, the paradox is that overlaying Curtis's labyrinthine tales and breathtaking montages of disparate images, there is always his own schoolmasterly and patrician narrative, telling you exactly what you're supposed to think about the otherwise ambiguous imagery and soundscapes he presents you with. The other method he uses is the logic of the perpetual reveal. A situation in the present is found to have its roots in the past, and its meaning is never as it seems. As many critics have noted, though, Curtis himself often appears to either be making unsubstantiated claims and wild connections, or simply contradicting himself about the meanings of these connections within a single narrative. The reveal keeps on revealing. In Can't Get You Out of My Head, Curtis's main thrust is the apparent incommensurability of the individual with the collective, and how all revolutionary movements are eventually thwarted by the bursting through of the individual. The individual's incompatible and often catastrophic desires, as we see in the case of Michael de Freitas and Jiang Qing, among others. But whilst his films are always visually and orally compelling, and the connections he makes often startling and profound, he consistently seems to bump up against the same fundamental issue. And in this last series, more noticeably than ever, that's the problem of subjectivity. Curtis goes to great length to tell the story of how he came to conceive of the concept of the individual, one of his abiding tropes and undeniably the star of Can't Get You Out of My Head. He draws out the connecting thread from early post-Freudians in the American tradition of ego psychology and its development into cognitive behavioral science, and rightly sees it as concomitant and complicit with the bureaucratization of the cultural sphere and managerialism in general. Curtis mounts an attack on positive psychology as a deeply conservative discourse. This, he argues, finds its expression in today's total datification of the social bond and the way in which algorithms have now taken over as the acephalic diffuse network of power, which in their supposedly benign and purely rational processes have the potential to create terrible forms of instrumental rationality. This is a story very familiar to those of us working in critical theory, philosophy, and the academic humanities in general, and has provoked much scorn from various quarters accusing Curtis of being out of touch with these discourses. The critique of psychology is common currency for Freudian psychoanalysis and critical theory in general, We know only too well how the pseudoscience of psychology reduces the complexity of subjectivity to a set of measurable norms, which are inherently ideological, reductive, and oppressive, and which now proliferates in endless iterations of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. But with regard to Curtis's perfunctory approach to the philosophical aspects of the discipline of psychology, I would say firstly that the film's necessary appeal to a wide audience must package things for maximum comprehensibility. I suppose there's nothing wrong with that. Secondly, I think it doesn't make sense to accuse Curtis of not being a critical theorist or even a historian when he never claimed that he was. But what it does seem to show is that there is still a huge gulf between academia, or more specifically, critical discourse on the media and the media itself, and particularly on questions of political subjectivity and how they're disseminated into popular culture. Curtis has 8 hours to play with his main concepts, the individual and power, but it seems he's reluctant to engage at all with 2 of the main problematizing strands in theories of subjectivity and their manifestation in leftist philosophies. That's to say, on the one hand, Marxist or Foucauldian analytics of power, and on the other, psychoanalysis. Why, for example, does he make reference constantly to the idea that nowadays we are all in our heads, that we believe that our feelings come from inside, and that this is in fact an illusion, which, had we consulted earlier sociological notions of selfhood, we would know is a modern myth? Is he being disingenuous? I mean, does he really want us to believe that he has no truck with Freudian or even Lacanian notions of the unconscious, or the idea of the Marxist Foucauldian power knowledge structure? These are well-trodden theories of subjectivity that already undermine the question of the self-present individual, which Curtis could have thrown in easily at the very least, if not properly engaged with. But he doesn't, and we have to ask why. For example, in a recent interview with Jacob Sugarman for In These Times, when asked what he considers an authentically radical movement today, Curtis states, and I quote, "Well, I think Black Lives Matter is really good because it's the first radical group in a long time that says, no, you don't just make the world better by making people behave nicely. It targets the corrupt and decaying structure of power around them. In the age of the individual, we have been encouraged to believe that everything we feel comes from inside us. So when we feel like shit, positive and behavioral psychology tells us to assume it's our fault. But there's an older sociological view that says a lot of what you do feel comes from inside you, but quite a lot of what you feel comes from where you are in society. If you're close to the structure of power, you benefit from it, and you tend to feel better than if you don't." He goes on, "I like Black Lives Matter because it argues that if you really want to address racism, you have to change the structure of power, and that's just inarguable. It took a group who are pretty much outside the mainstream of society to come smashing in and tell us that. I think that's really good. A lot of the progressive movements of the past 20 to 30 years, because they grew out of the age of individualism, stopped talking about power or lost sight of it. If you're going to change the modern world, you've got to actually work out where power is and how it works inside your head." End of quote. What's striking here is that Curtis seems to believe that Black Lives Matter emerged out of nowhere due to a renewed engagement with the idea of structural inequality. I don't think it would make any sense to think that BLM was a new idea. Rather, through the convergence of historical factors, they were able to emerge as a powerful force in the mainstream media in a way that had not been possible before. The ideas and frameworks that underpin BLM, the notions of subjection and structural inequality, post-coloniality, anti-Blackness, and the necessity for Black socio-economic empowerment are not only not new ideas conceptually in the realms of political struggle, but they are self-evident truths for subjugated people. This is perhaps where inevitably Curtis's standpoint may influence his approach. What Curtis seems to overlook is that ideas don't just spring fully formed from either the individual mind, nor even from the intellectual labor of the well-organized group, but rather they occur as a convergence of historical forces which sit within a given regime of truth. This in turn is related to the technological and discursive frameworks which govern the social bond at any historical period. But perhaps the old fantasy of the individual in his study making a discovery or coming up with an idea that changes the world is not so outlandish for Curtis. After all, for some people, the world really is like that. And this is not an ad hominem attack. White men from Oxford and Cambridge don't just see the world differently because they're privileged, but because their discourses have the power to materially shape the world to a much greater degree than most people. Ultimately, Curtis can literally set the agenda of his immediate environment because of the body in which he inhabits. And it seems like that's very much how he approaches the idea of historical change, because that's how it works for him. In a Zizek'ian sense, Curtis is his own blind spot in discourse, the stain on reality. I think then that beyond arguments that the BBC have historically limited their undeniably excellent output of critical engagements with questions of subjectivity, power, and politics to one middle-aged, Oxbridge-educated man, there is an important conceptual issue with Curtis's oeuvre and where it sits in relation to critical thinking in general. Ultimately, for all his apparent Oxfordian libertarianism, Curtis seems to have no theory of the subject at all, of history or even of power. But I think it would be too obvious to call his work Baudrillardian, in that clearly he's concerned with the play of signifiers, the exchange of objects, the loss of meaning, and the hyperreal in its most visual and tangible sense. In a way, it goes further than that. It's as if Curtis himself is a Baudrillardian subject created by the code. He himself is hyperreal. In Forget Foucault, Baudrillard argues that the only reason Foucault can critique power in the way that he did is because that system is already gone. It's in the past. Foucault gave precise details of the mechanics of power in discourse, and in that gesture was exercising the very same power and demonstrating its transparency and hence its obsolescence. According to Baudrillard, therefore, Foucault could only ever be a historian of power because he was always one step behind it, a product of it himself, hoisted by his own conceptual petard. What Curtis presents, like Foucault, is just too perfect. Could it be that, like Foucault, Curtis is already part and parcel of that very same operation of power? It's uncanny because in his cynicism, Curtis is the ideological one, telling you how everything is, but without problematizing. There's never any hint of doubt in what he says. Maybe that's because Curtis is talking about a world that's already dead. I think one of the most effective ways to read and watch Curtis is, in fact, to listen to him as if he were a fully Lacanian split subject. The narration is the superegoic or perverse injunction, the voice guiding us morally to make the right decisions. Meanwhile, the visuals are telling a whole other story, a stream of consciousness, the sliding of signifiers, and crucially, a constant reveal of the supposed moment of truth. Whilst Curtis tells us the truth has been found, the scopic drive continues to search for that elusive object A in the morass of seductive images. Perhaps then the deepest truth is to be found in the soundtrack to Curtis's film, a soundscape that provides the affective or emotional history that Curtis wants to tell. The question is, what does Curtis want? What is his desire? Is he the arch neoliberal, libertarian lefty, product of his time, neutral documentary maker, agent of the simulation? Or maybe his role is just to hystericize us, to make us desire something else. I think that's my 10 minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Isabel. Amazing presentations. Already got some chats going, particularly around the idea of Curtis perhaps occupying a Baudrillardian position himself, but also I love your idea of reading his voice or his subject through a Lacanian lens. Okay, we're going to move to Daniel. So please, Brett, please keep your note your questions down, and we'll have that general discussion at the end. Okay, next up is Brett Nichols. Brett works at the University of Otago in the Media, Film and Communications program, of which he's also he's the head of program. Brett's recent work tackles Baudrillard in science and also Baudrillard as a social theorist of the media. So please welcome Brett.
Thank you, Rosie, and thanks, Isabel, for that wonderful provocation. Yes, I think I agree that I look at Curtis and think that he's sort of a bad Baudrillardian, I think, in some senses. He should be more Baudrillardian than he actually is, whilst he unleashes all these sort of Baudrillardian themes. It's kind of interesting. I'm going to come at Curtis from a slightly different angle with my 10 minutes, and I'm going to be thinking about, for me, for me, the issue has always been, what is Curtis actually arguing here? He has this very authoritative narrative voice over these disparate images. So I'm really interested in thinking about, what he's actually arguing. And so I like to think of Curtis as a filmmaker that's making lots of descriptions about the world. I don't see him as a particularly prescriptive thinker at all. Maybe some might criticize him because of his lack of prescriptions. I think he's in a situation where his films are trying to understand what's going on in the world at the moment. And so, I think that it's interesting that in Curtis criticism, how that generally works. It seems to operate in two kind of modes, a split between two sort of positions. One position that Curtis is great. He's a provocateur. He raises some big, important questions. He's opening up some debates. Very few places where you have journalists tackling, the big kind of issues, big picture kinds of things. He's really good from that perspective. But then the problem with Curtis is that, we've got to worry about the way that he uses images. Do these images actually work as evidence, for the claim that he's actually making? All of these wild connections, the mention of the wild hippie sort of sums up, the way that we might approach how Curtis actually works. The second way of thinking about Curtis is kind of, he's basically just a crackpot conspiracist, and his films bear no relationship with reality whatsoever. That's a very prominent position, and a lot of parody hints or points towards the Curtis formula. She thought that they could make the better world a better place, but it sort of goes awry. That he's a crackpot kind of conspiracy theorist. My own approach to Curtis is to try to think about it in a different kind of a way. So interested in what kinds of descriptions he's actually making about the world. What sort of descriptions do we see in his films? And so, we see obvious sort of statements of fact, vox pops, various points of history and so on. But what's really interesting, what I think is fascinating about Curtis as a filmmaker is his use of the sort of mood and the way that the soundscape, various metaphorical images and so on actually work across his films. I'm most struck by these images of dancing, and these wonderful images of dancing that you see punctuating, this narrative. Another thing that I noticed is he's like really fascinated with corridors of power operating in a really interesting kind of way. And of course, the use of the irony of sound, I think, is really important, because I see that working in his films is about, in some cases, thinking about those descriptions as a way of undercutting power. I think that if there is one thing in Curtis's films, it's this idea that power needs to be questioned. So, that's interesting. So if that's the case, then what sort of form would this questioning take? And so what I've tried to do in my work is put together something that might look like a Curtis sociology. What would that look like? And another way of putting that might be to say that, you could actually say, what sort of Russian novel is Curtis actually writing, where you have these characters caught up in the broader sweep of history. He's this big, powerful narrative voice that's, talking about the plight of these particular characters in the sweep of history. That'd be one way to think about it too. But I'm going to try to think about Curtis in terms of, what a Curtis sociology might actually look at. And if you look at the way that he thinks about society, it consists obviously of these different stratifications. You have the power elites, you have the state and politicians, you have experts and other pundits and cultural influencers. You have the economy and the financial sector. You have the military pops up every now and then. And then, of course, you have the people, which takes various forms. He never really theorizes this. He never really, develops what he means by this idea. And I think what he takes as a sort of normative ideal for how a society should be, a normative sociological ideal, is that what we have is that the people have a democratic relationship to the state, and that the state is there to represent the people, the interests of the people against or in relation to big power or to elite power. This is a repeated sort of motif that turns up in what he's doing. And then the argument is always that is being thwarted. And then so then he follows what's the thwarting of that. And in particular, I can't get you out of my head, this is a major sort of trajectory that he tries to, and I think, rather in a cumbersome sort of way, tries to chart this. So the first thing, and this turns up across his work, is that it's defeated by the failure of democratic movements. As Isabel pointed out, this is a sort of common theme. People rise up to try to change the world, but then they figure out individualism gets in the way, and it turns into something terrible than what they've actually what they've actually aimed for. So the big ideal always kinds of always sort of fails. The other thing is that related to that is that democracy's been eroded by the rise of individualism. He doesn't really tell us very much about what he means by individualism, but he seems to work in sort of a very clunky way in thinking about this relationship between the collective versus the individual. So he sees collectivity and democracy as a thing, and then on the other side you have the individual, who this irrational individual who's driven by their desires, and in the end the irrational individual ends up believing in nothing. They abandon ideology and so on, and this leads us down this sort of, I think the path of sort of nihilism, I think, is what's coming through in his work. The thing though is that the next thing that he says is that this individual presents a problem for power. So what power does, because the state has already abandoned politics and given itself over to the market, what power does is it turns itself over to sort of technocratic rational means for governing and controlling the individual. These are the sort of Baudrillardian sort of elements of how that works. And this is where he's most Baudrillardian, I think, is because in that process of rational management, what happens is, in the name of the good, to make the world a better place, what happens is that evil or bad or extreme phenomena and so forth rush back in, to fill the void that's created by that. Politics itself reformulates, which is the next thing he argues, and it starts to see itself as a sort of non-political, see itself in terms of non-political intervention in the world. So his examples here is always Blair and Bush, going into Iraq after the terrible situation had been left by the English in the colonial sort of power of the English. Blair and Bush go in as the rescuers and the liberators of everybody, not in terms of some political ideal or ideology, but in terms of the idea that everybody can be liberated. So what happens then, I think, in this Baudrillardian sort of sense, what happens then, I think he argues that the West implodes. It implodes because it doesn't actually stand for anything. It's abandoned big ideas. It's abandoned ideology. I mean, Curtis uses ideology in a fairly old-fashioned sort of sense as, a set of political ideas. He doesn't use it in a Zizekian or a Althusserian sort of sense. He just uses it as a set of political ideas. So we should be committed to an ideology, I think. So in that, what happens is that because the West implodes, inequality becomes worse, and the other sort of narrative that he traces there is the rise of China, which I think is an interesting sort of narrative in Can't Get You Out of My Head, because he almost seems to reproduce the idea that earlier in the film, he's talking about the yellow peril. He almost seems to reproduce that kind of narrative by saying that Deng Xiaoping reformulates China after the revolutionary years, and it's governed by a desire or a policy that's about wreaking revenge on the West. So he, into that void steps the China as a global power. But what's really important here, in that void left by the West's implosion, is the emergence of new sorts of nationalisms, new fascisms, if you will. Trump, Brexit, Putin are the examples that he gives of this. And also in China, the idea of a mythical past that somehow engenders China's place in the geopolitical and economic world. So I think, for me, Curtis is a sort of an interesting kind of figure in the sense that it seems like what he's saying, and I'm not sure about this, is that what we need to do is to get back to the big ideas. What we need to do is to have big thinking, intellectual ideas. To me, that's the direction that he heads. And it's always disappointing to me that he doesn't really interrogate very much the way in which anti-intellectualism has been sort of cultivated by conservative politics over a number of years now, so that we end up in this place where nobody can actually have an informed discussion about anything. Okay, I'll leave it there, Rosie. Thanks.
Many thanks, Brett. I think that's a fantastic point to end on, this idea of the anti-intellectual, right? And in a way, I mean, he addresses populism throughout his films, and certainly in Can't Get You Out of My Head. And populism in some ways goes along with this anti-intellectualism. And I have the same sort of sense of misgiving too around the idea of the big idea. Well, which big idea? We're still sort of that's not quite clear as a salve or solution, though perhaps that's not his intention. But thank you, Brett. Again, a fantastic provocation there. So again, holding on to your thoughts, keep the chatting going. I'll also save the chat as a file too, so you can email me afterwards if you want the chat file. Next up, we have Daniel Tutt. Daniel lectures in philosophy at George Washington University and has produced an Emmy-nominated documentary film called The Sultan and the Saint, about religion and violence during the Crusades. He's also the author and editor of a forthcoming book called Theologies and Ethics of Justice in Islam. His writing and research examines continental philosophy, Marxist thought, and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Please welcome Daniel and take the Zoom stage.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. Rosie, thank you for putting this really stimulating event on. This is delightful to be here. And the first two talks have been incredible. So I want to, some sense, maybe echo a few points that have already been made, but to also look a little bit at the two primary thematic zones of Can't Get You Out of My Head, which I actually really liked. It was very cringe in some ways in the beginning, but I think actually the whole series kind of was a nice companion to hypernormalization. And I really consider what he's doing here as a kind of documentarian genealogy of ideas. And the two ideas that have sort of already been mentioned are sort of social atomization and this kind of new form of hyper-individualism. So one of the things that's very interesting is that, he's not interrogating the project of the individual from its status post-French Revolution or even from its status in a grand historical sense, but he's talking about the modern without talking about the postmodern or any kind of break with the modern, which is actually one of the points that I do want to raise. Furthermore, in Curtis's account, discipline and control mechanisms are guided by the psychological and scientific community. So there's this kind of similar dynamic, which is, from a Marxist point of view, a very idealist one, which is that some ingenuity occurs in the field of cybernetics or of some mode of academic psychology, which is then utilized by elites, but then the very basis of this new technology becomes like a Frankensteinian monster, right? And then so power fragments, and we're left with a world which is premised on what I would consider a fundamentally populist vision of power, the elites versus the people. There's no real consideration of class struggle that's presented, and we are haunted by a form of individualism, which was defined by Mao Zedong's wife as being a unit of one. And as we know, she becomes one of the central characters in a very interesting way, actually. So the problem that I have here is actually how Curtis is treating the category of the masses. One of the subtitles, or one of the titles of the episodes, is "Are the People Stupid?" And I think that there is a pervasive pessimism, and I think that Isabel and Brett both alluded to that. I really like the point of his own standpoint as a kind of bourgeois subject, in the way in which, yes, the very project of the bourgeoisie is itself tied into a type of pessimism qua the masses, and thus so is liberalism as such, if you have a kind of keen eye to that. I think also that there's two telling omissions from his genealogy of power. The first one I'll raise is in his discussion of the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. He does not mention or discuss any possible influence that the fact that the largest anti-war protest movement in US history and global history occurred in response to it. And in his conversation of the rise of Brexit and Trump, which he locates to his credit in a longer historical origin over resentment over the transition from industrial to financial capital. In essence, this transition is one marked by a movement away from the general welfare Fordist state, which is very familiar to us academics, to finance capital and the horrors of neoliberalism, which again is very familiar categories for us. But Curtis doesn't frame it in that way. He only kind of loosely alludes to that. And then he furthermore links that genealogy to a kind of resentment which was kicked up from austerity policies following 2008, both in Britain and the US. So these are by now standard populist accounts of both the rise of Trump and Brexit. Curtis goes further than this, however, and argues that Trump and Brexit also occurred because of a new mutation of the hyper-individual control mechanisms, what Bernard Stiegler and others call algorithmic control mechanisms, right, that are sort of pervasive over the lives of everyday citizens. And for this, we have the Cambridge Analytica role, both with the first election of Trump and, of course, with Brexit. But absent in this retelling is the rise of the protest movement in 2011, which was also very much causally linked to 2008, what we globally know as the movement of the squares, which toppled Mubarak and brought political figures such as Sanders and Corbyn into prominent, what I would consider moral positions of power in the Western political spaces. Where did these figures come from? In Curtis's view, collective individualism is dead. But isn't the rebirth of democratic socialism and new forms of communist thinking across the world a sign that it's not dead? I claim that the People's Revolt of the Squares movement, which took the form of Occupy in the US, without these, you would have no Bernie Sanders. So these omissions are a sign of Curtis's pessimism and of a missing logic in his very idea of how social power works and of the very notion of causality of social power that he develops. If the masses are totally devoid of thinking and action, and collectivist possibility is gone today, then the very consequence of this is that any change could only come from inside the system, not from outside. Now, in Marx's periodization of historical power, the struggles of the masses are placed at the very center of analysis, as I'm sure many of you know, even if the situation has generally pacified the masses. And I think, no doubt, the masses have been pacified today, and Curtis very persuasively documents this fact. Yet, despite the seeming pacification of the masses, the logic of their agency still remains a central way to understand power and resistance. The big takeaway from the series is that, quote, no one has any idea of how to change things, and that this is the effect of both the absence of the masses as well as an inability to think the individual as a collective form. But what if the masses are placed into the logic of power that Curtis tracks? What if the string of seemingly random events that emerge out of this kind of ahistorical, chaotic morass, which he documents, what if he included the revolts, the contestations to power, which also already are engaged there? Now, I know that Isabel mentioned he has a kind of fondness for Black Lives Matter, but notice that in his films, you do not get an optimistic picture, okay, of resistance movements until or after neoliberalization, basically, right? Which I think is a very curious and pessimistic omission, okay? And I also agree with Brett that he is basically leaning on the late Baudrillard here, in Baudrillard's late conception of hegemony, for which, as you probably know, power is not construed as between the dominated and dominators. Rather, power is this kind of sort of post-disciplinary arrangement. And I think that in that sense, Brett and Isabel are correct that he is a kind of poor reader of Baudrillard, if he is even a reader at all. And I also want to stress how important Brett's article actually is on Curtis's entire project, where he points out, especially in hypernormalization, the very title of the film leans on a misreading of Baudrillard. But that's a whole separate thing. So from these comments, I want to list or sort of pose 4 questions or provocations. Number 1, when did precisely this form of hyper-individualism start? So in Can't Get Out of My Head, Curtis develops an intricate series of examples centered around the way this new insidious individualism develops and came to dominate. Using character studies of Solzhenitsyn, the liberal Russian dissident during Stalin's time, and Jian Qing, Mao's wife, were introduced to the idea that the collectivist notions of the individual founded in the communist states of Russia and China were already somehow mysteriously possessed with this insidious and hyper form of individualism, with no account of why that might have been the case. Curtis does not necessarily express sympathy with the collective individual, nor does he refer or consult communist or Marxist thoughts of individualism, for which there are ample. And yet, in a very interesting way, Curtis also does not seem to have a sympathy for liberal notions of the individual. So we're left with a kind of pessimism qua any proposal of individualism, as I read it. Furthermore, there's no discussion of the effects of the Cultural Revolution in China, which could have been at all positive, which is an interesting omission. So again, these pessimistic omissions are very telling. Number two, what is distinctly modern for Curtis? Is there something prior to the modern? When does the modern start? We're left to assume there is no post-modern, as evidenced by the subtitle of the film, A History of the Modern World. At the same time, because there is only the modern, we have no true historical foothold to interrogate when power might have been treated differently than it is now. So this atemporal and ahistorical treatment of the modern leads Curtis to portray the people's relation to the past as always fundamentally a fantasy, as always a bubble in which they're hiding from the present. So this is profoundly ahistorical. And I think in some sense it's very interesting that as a journalist, he permits himself to perform this ahistoricism. Number three, does resistance to power also have a genealogy and a logic, or is contestation to power always inefficacious? So many commentators have rightly pointed out that Curtis embraces the idea of the post-political, which is a category which I think is very much resonant with a lot of his formulations and frameworks. In other words, since about the 1970s, any collective attempt to challenge power fails and nothing is learned. Therefore, there is no continuity to revolts or resistance. We see this developed in hypernormalization, where the very mode of this possessive individualism is weaponized by the 60s generation who abandoned that very form of collective struggle. So basically, since that time, collective contestations seem to be off the table. I want to briefly put this into conversation with a text which might help Curtis if he were to listen to our pleas here, which would be Postscript on the Societies of Control by Gilles Deleuze, written in 1992, where in a very curious way, which I think we often forget, Deleuze actually leans on a very Marxist conception of power as the idea in which power remains relevant even in the post-political, even though he doesn't quite use that term. But instead, I think that Curtis performs the same liberal notion that communistic or Marxist theories of power or of individualism are inadequate because in his view, they're unicausal. Therefore, they only think causality vis-a-vis proletarian. They only think causality vis-a-vis teleology, or they only think causality vis-a-vis one side. Now, Deleuze will actually say that the rise of his periodization of the control societies actually occurs around the late 19th century, at which point power moves away from disciplinary or juridical power to the idea that there are a multiplicity of powers, what he calls an archipelago of powers. And then he furthermore suggests that this is very much in concert with Marx's work, especially the late work on the Grundrisse, which is really about post-industrial capitalism, right? And I think also Deleuze, in some sense, echoes what Curtis needs to further refine when he says institutions now in this new alignment of power come before the state. So I think that there's a very interesting thesis that Curtis picks up on vis-a-vis the power of the impotent state, if we like that phrase, right? And of course, all of this would help Curtis's notion of the emotional and of the affective domain of individualism, because the shift also involves a shift from the you must not prohibition of the exterior censor superego to the compulsion of the performative internal superego, right? Again, these formulations would have, I think, very much made a more coherent picture of the periodization and of the genealogy that he's working with, but they are denied. Final point, how will the post-political quagmire come to an end if all power is lost to the masses? Will the end or the revolution come about through a system collapse, or is there not already a mode of negativity within the system today? Now, Curtis argues, like Baudrillard, that negativity is absent, right? And here I think we should invoke Badiou, who argues that our present should be thought as already animated by the negative, right? And that the logic of the masses is already a kind of source of negativity, which should be affirmed and whose consequences should be followed and so on, right? So there is a dialectical account of the masses, of the oppressed and of exploitation, right? One that can place them in a kind of seat of agency, right? Therefore, the notion, and I like this very much, of invoking Tupac and Abu Zubaydah as these kind of prophetic savants of the impossibility of the collective individual to take off, right? In any kind of explicit communal form, right? I like that gesture. One, because I think it's clever. I'll give him that, right? But two, it kind of gives a heuristic for a kind of Curtis-centered theory of contestation of power, right? So my only wager back to him would be like, actually, I would like your films a great deal more if you brought the same theory of causality and so on, but included this kind of absent masses. So if we can get over these kinds of pessimisms, I think the brilliance of his styles and of his techniques and all of that would be much more well received. I'll end with that.
Thank you, Daniel. Another wonderful provocation and lots of claps and chats in the chat. And I love how you brought together Deleuze's control societies as a kind of interlocutor with Curtis, and also the provocation around where the negative sits within his films and how that might work in terms of a kind of pessimism, which does seem to run through his oeuvre. Okay, so I'm up next, and my riff really is a riff. Some of you have heard me talk before and perhaps will roll your eyes at my type of creative writing response almost to this work, but I wanted to kind of unpack particularly the title, the Can't Get You Out of My Head, and the subtitle, An Emotional History of the Modern World. And again, I had the same wonder as Daniel about what modern might mean to Curtis in terms of even the postmodern as well. So can you all see my shared screen? Yep. Okay, so I'm just going to play the Kylie song, not with the sound, but with the image. So who else has been bopping about with Kylie in their heads the past fortnight? She sings, I just can't get you out of my head. Boy, your lovin' is all I think about. I just can't get you out of my head. Boy, it's more than I dare to think about. This song that or even another relaunched the Singing Budgies' career in 2001. And perhaps my fondness for Kylie is because I'm an Australian, but of course she is a global pop sensation. And this she's had another relaunch since this relaunch in 2001. This song was in my head. It's catchy. I'm caught. Perhaps, in Curtis's words, it's a trap. Pop culture is catchy. It catches us up with the latest, the hottest, and all manner of upbeat superlatives, and catches us in. A warm embrace? Sure. After watching Curtis's latest, I catch myself humming, la, 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 la. I'm no singer, right? I catch myself humming this in the hallways at work. A memory surfaces, a place, a time elsewhere. 2001, high school socials. It's a funny thing when you catch yourself humming. I'd whistle if I could. So far, I've always cut the hum of La La short. As some of you might know, I'm a metalhead. My book's about death metal. That's my book. I'm an academic and not an ACCA fan, a detestable word. My hum gets stuck. The song's stuck in my head though, looping there without a mouth to hum it out. The other day, a colleague who's in the Zoom room today, in jest, in play, said, Lacanians, they pun or they cut. We defer to a tricky ruse, which might make us smile or leave us alarmed, or something else, something worse. Are puns and cuts so different from one another? That's my colleague's point, no doubt. They both do something with that catch of language. It's like an artful drop from the catch, a needle drop on a turntable. I see some discussion, a remark about can't get you out of my head. Nice drop, somebody writes on Discord regarding Curtis's inclusion of Phosphorescence song Fazula. Maybe a bit of what Curtis does is catch us up, then form a drop. An idea, perhaps? An idea let to fall in our lapses, Pop culture is catchy. What if it catches us in a trap rather than a warm embrace? Brett points out in his paper that I've shared in the chat that Curtis's logic is not either or. Rather, it might be more capacious, a dueling, as in fighting type of logic, the logic of Baudrillard. Sure, it's not just either or, this catch, this thing we get caught up in, but still this trap thing, this caught in a web thing, this caught in a network of signifiers thing, well, it's compelling, it's catchy. Catchy things can run over old grooves. We've heard that one before. The one where Curtis does the reveal, as Isabel pointed out, it's sort of series of reveals. He shows us the real, a pizza parlor for pedophiles, a mad jihadi tells lies. Yes, we've all heard that one before. I say aloud on a couch somewhere, he's the voice of God, but he's not. He's sardonic. My interlocutor replies, well, what is God if not sardonic? That one's not a pun. Maybe it was a cut then. It caught me in my tracks, in my groove, that one, and I teach that one. Week 2, the observational documentary, Grierson, Corner, Aitken, and shout out to Annie, one of my students from that class. I teach that. Narration, pedagogy, and all that. That's a catch. It's neat then, that. To return then to the catch in the track, it might split up the neat oneiness of some of those traps, the unit of one. And as Isabel pointed out, if we could read Curtis literally as this split sort of Lacanian subject, nice drop, that. I can't get you out of my head, Kylie warbles. I wonder something about that. Curtis leaves off the I. The title is Can't Get You Out of My Head, returning to Isabel's provocations around the subject in his films. Can't get you out of my head. But of course, the you implies an I, not an either or. I and thee? No. But who is the one who's caught in the subtitle, in the emotional history here? It's not so straightforward as the who is the one who warbles, the gal who dares to think about, though I pause, wonder why we see the back cover of Afeni Shakur's LP of revolutionary poetry, only the cover. Her voice, though, does not feature. Not such a catch, not catchy. Astra Taylor and Tiana Reid wondered elsewhere. What if that voice, sardonic god Curtis, was the voice of a valley girl, a voice from elsewhere? My voice, I hate to hear it zooming here and there. It's sing-song. I'm doing Dr. Seuss here, right? La, 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 la. I'm not so sure, though, that a different drop, a different voice would make such a muddle out of this catch. So to replace Curtis's voice with the Valley Girl, would that change everything? He may not even be quoting our Kylie, as we Australians refer to her. It's a turn of phrase, after all, that some things catch. Once caught, they stick, repeat in our heads, spilling out in hums, this way and that. I think Curtis shows us something about these turns, these revolutions. Recall, for Lacan, a revolution is a full circuit, a frenzied turn without a cut. Such frenzies can be loving, let's recall. The master might, or indeed often does, regain his footing, whether the agent is Madame Mao or Michael X, or whomever's the latest to make that call, to catch us in that weight of the word revolution. Puns and cuts. Curtis takes us on so many turns, we get dizzy. Do we drop or do we dance? That leitmotif. Kylie tells us that this frenzied la 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 thing is something that is all she dared to think about. My hum cut short. Perhaps what Curtis does in what seems like a catch-all, but cuts up all those catches in the montage, is just that la la la, that blah blah blah. See Kylie swaying in circles in the video clip. Which album was it again? She sways, circular. She sways in circles of pop culture, of circuits. Perhaps what Curtis does is not the master's thing at all, not the big man thing, but a dropping thing, a failing thing. The la 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 leaves off, but something leaves over. A thing that might move us, an emotional thing, elsewhere. And I'll leave that there. So thank you for listening to my, again, Seuss-like riff. But I hope there was some resonances that maybe perhaps I brought together in that. So thank you to Isabel, Brett and Daniel for participating in the discussion. And our bits are sort of over now, although we'll respond, we're respondents now, but please, I really want to open it up for discussion and debate. So please raise your hand and let's get talking. Okay, Clint, I think, yes, unmute. Thank you.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. That was a great discussion. I think it's funny, you know, Canadians are always told we're too polite, but when Isabel gave her talk and people kept calling it a provocation, I mean, I think it was a great talk, but I don't know what it was thought-provoking, but provocative or provocation makes it sound as though someone's almost on the outside of the permitted sort of range of things. But maybe this is just a Kiwi version of the word intervention. I don't know. I like to fall into ethnic stereotypes, so you know, I'm sure New Zealanders have their afflictions. But I thought this was really good, and I want to come back to something I said in the chat, which was to talk about what Curtis is doing formally, or even just to belabor a point, the puns and cuts in the sense of the montage and the edits, and then the ways in which that perpetual reveal or the perpetual motion reveal, which is the drive, essentially, right? Which is his obsession, which is his tic, which is his symptom, but it's a cinematic or formalistic symptom. And then the nature, so that formal aspect, but then in a more perhaps Baudrillardian sense, the question of the archive and of archival footage, and the ways in which the nostalgia, the simulacral nostalgia, sheen, the quality of the color. I mean, I would become a Maoist, even though as a professor I would have to wear that sign around my neck saying I'm an idiot, if I could just look at those colors. Those were those colors from the 50s and 60s of those films and operas and so on. They are so, they're kind of like a Maoist version of Kodacolor, I guess, and they're amazing. So that formal aspect, and where does that formal aspect of what is happening there, and especially then that he can't be a Lacanian, because there's no, besides showing Lacan standing somewhere, there's no image. There's no archival imagery of Lacanians doing psychoanalysis. Whereas you can show some guy, the Kubrick like Clockwork Orange sort of thing. You can show that eye. Those behaviorists, they documented the hell out of what they were doing. So I mean, I think the two parts that I would ask our four panelists to think about. One is the question of the role of the archive in your political reading. And the second is the role of Curtis's formal method in your political reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Clint. And I'll avoid using provocation. As you say, it's more an intervention. Good point. And fair dues, as we say in New Zealand. So would any of the panelists like to respond to Clint's question about particularly around form and the archive?
I mean, I guess I could say something. I've tried to sort of grapple with the formal aspects of what Curtis is trying to do. I mean, I think his approach to the archive, like, he's kind of encyclopedic, isn't he? Like, he has hard drives full of images that he catalogues, and he tries to, and they're just sort of in his head in some ways. The title of the film, I Can't Get You Out of My Head, is probably a statement about Curtis himself, that he can't get this sort of all of these weird images out of his head that he draws upon, and he seems to be able to do that in an interesting kind of way. Formally, for me, obviously the issue has to do with the relationship between the narrator voice. I liked Isabel's term, the patrician narrator voice, and the fragments that the narrator voice marshals to make a particular story and to construct moods. But it always comes across as a little bit haphazard. I think in the end, it's really just Curtis's patrician image of how he sees the world. Has anyone else got anything to say?
Isabel, would you like to respond?
On the question of the narration of Curtis's voice over the images, I always feel when I watch his films really conflicted, because on the one hand, I feel like I'm experiencing something really radical and subversive and exciting, but then I hear this voice and it just really annoys me, because maybe it just sounds like my dad, I don't know, but there's this particular type of authority to everything that he does that doesn't leave any space for you to make up your own mind. And it's paradoxical, because that doesn't seem to be what he's doing with his work. It doesn't seem to be that he's telling you what to think, but yet his voice is always telling you what to think. And so it annoys me. So I watch it and I'm finding it really interesting, but then it like niggles at the back of my head and I'm like, oh, just fucking shut up. And I suppose, and maybe that's my own symptom, but I do think that there is something in his method that is deliberately sort of conflictual. And I think he obviously knows full well the effect of his presence and how there is some sort of dislocation going on between what he appears to be doing and how he makes you feel with the way that he constantly undermines himself with his choice of music and his sort of humorous takes on all of his imagery. And also it's interesting because when you listen to Adam in interviews, so far that I've seen, he's very humorless. He doesn't come across as a very ironic man. And, like listening to him with Russell Brand the other day, it was really funny because Russell was like taking the piss out of him, and they obviously have a good relationship, like they seem to be friends, but Adam just really could not bear Russell Brand jibing with him and like teasing him, and he kept trying to say, oh come on Adam, have a bit of a laugh, and just silence, and Russell was pissing himself. He was like, well, what's the problem? Why do you have to keep looking at your phone? Why are you getting embarrassed? And Adam was like, I think you use humor as a defense. You use humor as a defense, Russell. And he's like, no, I use it as an attack, Adam. And like, that this was something that he felt really uncomfortable with, the idea that he wasn't in control of the situation. And then he hit back and said, well, no, actually, I like to be the one in control. And it was quite interesting. It was like a moment of revelation where Adam actually let his guard down and was like, well, no, actually, I don't like that feeling of not being the one in control. And I come back to this point about the Oxbridge man, because the Oxbridge voice is pervasive in all of his work. It's there in the back of our minds, whether we like it or not. There is that ideology behind it that is very comfortable and secure in his view of the world. So however much he may be making us feel like he's having radical opinions, there is this really, really conservative thread that runs through everything he does. I mean, he says it himself that people think he's a lefty, but actually he's more like a neoconservative or a libertarian. Which I find it very interesting. And I don't know, maybe this is we're all desperately running around trying to work out what he is, when he's like, well, I've told you what I am. Why are you all like going crazy about it? But yeah, so there's something there that I find confusing.
Yes, very good response, absolutely. And there's a lot in the comments too. I like Matisse's point that in some ways, though it's a sort of classic archival film with the cut-ups, it also, which is like an older model, it also almost resembles the scroll feed of these images sort of disconnected that we encounter in our everyday lives. I'm just going to go to the next question, and we've got Ishik up next. So,
hello.
Hi.
I wanted to remind you the scene with the animation of seeing dogs everywhere. It seems to be related to can't get you out of my head. Like you fall out of the symbolic, like in psychosis, and the emptiness of the real is filled by delusions. Seeing dogs everywhere because it's coded, and it's like the object A, can't get you out of my head. And it felt like he is like helping the West traverse their fantasies through their films. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. That does remind me of what Isabel's comment about how the film sort of works as a repetition of a screen. I mean, Clint's words may be his symptom here. We see constantly almost him looking for that mark or image, that stain. Does anyone from the panel want to comment on Ishik's, I guess, the bringing up of that seeing dogs everywhere, and that sort of footage where it's just endlessly zooming in?
I like the idea of in that image of the sort of the fractal nature of that particular idea. I thought it's a great image, actually, as a metaphor for how a sort of an algorithmic and a machinic way of thinking about subjectivity ends up just becoming caught up in its own, because there's no outside, it gets caught up in its own kind of logic, and so can only ever see, what it's looking for.
I was thinking of Daniel's mention of Stiegler's idea of algorithmic control mechanisms. Maybe, Daniel, you could speak to Ishik's question, or?
Yeah, I think it's a nice provocation to think of the proposal, especially of the psychosis and conspiracy, although I've really been thinking from a Lacanian lens lately, especially with QAnon, which is mentioned at the end of the film, after that sequence, which everybody probably tuned out, 50% maybe tuned out, thinking that was the credits, that image, but then he went on, right? But I actually think the contemporary form of conspiracy is very much more perversion, which is maybe a more technical point. I don't think that the conspiracy structure is very psychotic, and I'm very hesitant to even invoke psychosis when we're looking at structures today. I'm much more inclined to think through things like borderline and through the way in which Trumpism and Q is really reliant on a perverse form of authority and perverse form of mastery. But that's maybe an aside. As it pertains to the thesis that he's helping the West confront their fundamental fantasies and like something like that, I'm not sure that I even accept the thesis of how apathy is functioning within the fantasy, or even that I accept the thesis that there is a consistency on behalf of subjectivity that relates to the past in the structure that Curtis is suggesting. I'd have to give that more thought, but I think things are far more complex. For example, the election of Biden is absolutely ushering in a large scale sense amongst petty bourgeois classes and middle classes more generally of some kind of restoration of normalcy, right? So the whole premise, therefore, that we're living in a time where there is a kind of ubiquitous desire for total structural change, I'm actually not sure that thesis can be supported. I think there is amongst the educated intellectual classes, but that's a different thing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some.
Fantastic. A really good, interesting point to this idea of thinking of this conspiracy theorist as a perverse structure rather than psychotic. Yeah. Okay, we might go to Jack now, who has their hand up.
Hey, thanks so much. This has been a really, really interesting panel, and really, really cool to like hear all these ideas and discussion around this really, really thought-provoking film. One thing that I wanted to kind of bring in here was this thesis that kind of runs throughout Adam Curtis's work, where you have kind of radical populist movements that are then kind of recuperated through a means of a culture. So it becomes a cultural object and becomes songs and art instead of actually carrying out the kind of political message of the movement. And this is something that really, really struck me about his work, coming to it as an artist and activist that is grappling with these issues of aestheticizing politics and kind of the potential and limits of that. And I just wonder if the panelists have any kind of takes on that, and kind of where he gets it right, where he gets it wrong, and kind of how we can kind of use these films to think through these problems in a kind of constructive, material way. Thanks.
Thanks, Jack. Panelists? I was thinking, Brett, perhaps your point about thinking through Curtis and social theory.
Well, I can say that, from the perspective of teaching, that I find Curtis's films, having students watch Curtis's films, to actually be really useful to introduce a lot of the ideas that we would actually be talking about in the classroom. So, and it really gives the students a sense that, well, okay, these ideas are sort of out there. This is not sort of an isolated academic type thing. So I appreciate that a lot. In fact, my favorite film, my favorite Curtis film is actually The Century of the Self, that series, because I've found that the most useful especially in media, film and communication, where we are interested in critiques of advertising and so on. So I find, from that perspective, I find it really useful. And also, a great point to, raise questions and define points of differentiation and critique. So, that's why I became sort of interested in Curtis, really.
I can say one quick thing on this. The whole thesis, which is very much more Marxist in orientation, which links up to your point of the new spirit of capitalism by Chiapello, which is the whole thesis on 68 and the appropriation of 68 as a cultural phenomenon. But even this is something that Curtis just hasn't discovered, but if he did, he would throw it in his film in a heartbeat, and he should. That whole beautiful thesis they developed, which was literally the slogans on the street of 68 in France, were then, in a matter of a couple of decades, incorporated into business literature, right? And so that the kind of horizontalism of the demands was easily introduced into the corporate sphere, right? In a kind of seamless fashion. And I think that one can kind of recoil from this notion, a kind of pessimistic absence of a dialectic, right? That there's sort of no negativity. And I would kind of go back to that point to help sort of push through this, as opposed to sort of seeing these struggles as imminent, right? So I would, but I think you're right, and I really think there is a doomsday, almost quasi-theological pessimism with Curtis, apropos this shift into neoliberalization, and here we haven't talked about this, but even the boomer status, even though generational stuff is kind of passé, but the fact that he himself kind of comes, I don't know, he's late Gen X, boomer, whatever, but you see my point. Like, there's also, and you see this in hypernormalization as well, that kind of Jane Fonda exhaustion with the project of collective liberation. Well, is this something felt qua boomers, or is this truly, right? So there's all of these kind of absent collectivities, right? And anytime Curtis refers to the all, he's very suspicious of this. So that's what I would say.
That's really interesting there. And I think that point about, I mean, he even, one of the New Yorker interview, he talks about, he kind of is aware of his own nostalgia or melancholy as someone born in the early 50s and has a kind of ambivalent relationship.
Trotskyist family.
Really? See, this is interesting.
This is what I've heard, yeah, which is very interesting, apropos the kind of authority and so there's something there.
Isabel, do you have any comment on Jack's comment or question around the usefulness, I guess, of Curtis's films and their aesthetic, how they work perhaps aesthetically to materially as a critique?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, we should say that inevitably, whenever academics get together and talk about things, they have to nitpick over all the bad stuff. But it goes without saying that, Adam Curtis, that he's sort of unparalleled, isn't he? There isn't anyone doing what he does, and that's why we're talking about him, because he has created such an amazing body of work. And I think, it goes without saying that his contribution to bringing critical thought and ideas into public discourse is essential. And the only gripe, I suppose, is that why isn't there more? And we want more of it, and we want more people to be doing it, and we want more different types of people to be doing it. But again, he's talented. There's no getting away from that. But because he does have such an important role, and I think that he has really shaped so much of the sort of last 10 years of young people kind of getting to grips with these ideas, who maybe wouldn't have had the opportunity to engage with them, because he has that important role. I think we hold him to sort of account and want him to be like, no, explain Foucault, and why don't you put the proper Marxist interpretation of it? Like, of course he can't do that. It's television as well, like that can't be really done on television. So I think we expect a lot from him, and I think perhaps he could do more. I don't know.
I I agree. I mean, he is a journalist. His platform is the BBC, though, of course, we've all accessed it via, in the colonies, via, you know, illegal means, actually, or through VPN, these sorts of things. And I love the chat's going wild here. We've got this idea about BBC as a legacy platform, but also the idea of perhaps someone put pipeline from Trotskyist to neocon. I mean, again, I think that's provocative. Maybe it's just an intervention. Anyway, Eugenie, you've got your hand up. Welcome. Oh, just unmute.
Thank you, Rosie. I am a latecomer. Thank you for the welcome. Thank you for hosting. You know, I'm really pleased that this event is occurring. I'm loving what I'm hearing just in these last 10 minutes. And I apologize if I'm sort of having come in late and rehashing or introducing something that you've done thoroughly. Tell me quickly if that's so. But my inquiry is, first of all, I adore Adam Curtis, and I sort of grew up on him, if you like, or, you know, he's been a big figure in my ability to critique anything. But I've also recently, in the last couple of years, come to Lacan, Jacques Lacan. And as I now watch an Adam Curtis production with a Lacanian, you know, viewer's viewpoint, I'm struck by some things that I wonder if everybody else has been onto this all along, or whether you can sort of contextualize for me. I found it easier actually to propose to myself that my criticism now of Curtis was that he's talking about power, but a very particular sort of power that wouldn't fit in very easily to Jacques Lacan's Seminar 17, say, or this May 68 outcome. Jacques Lacan himself formalized it, or, you know, the sound bite from it is, you're after a new master and you'll get one. That a revolution, in fact, is a revolve around a process, and you come back to the same point. You might have a different master, you might think they're better, but they'll fulfill the role, that same old role of master. And also the Foucault idea of power is such a different one to Curtis's idea of power, that they sort of, I thought this, on this viewing of this documentary, they're hard to reconcile at all. And yet, you know, as you just said, Isabel, I mean, I just fairly adore this guy, and his beauty, the beauty of his productions, the material he can bring, the popular environment that he can infiltrate, a bit like Zizek perhaps, you know, is such an entertainer, is such a communicator, worth so very much. But I wonder if somebody can sort of put Curtis together with Jacques Lacan, perhaps Seminar 17 in particular, and have a proposal for, do they meet at all?
Thanks, Eugenie. I did mention Seminar 17 in my riff, which was that point about the revolution as a circle. Of course, you know, we're both studying it at the moment. So, but I'm thinking this, in a way, perhaps Curtis is showing that. In as Brett, Isabel and Daniel kind of point out, I think from different perspectives, the revolutions he portrays fail again and again. A new master is ever installed. And I also agree with Daniel's recommendation of Boltanski and Schiapolo's book on this as well. The failure of May 68 and that repetition again and again, and it's shown with the Madame Mao of the Cultural Revolution as well. But I'm also interested in Daniel's point about Curtis's perhaps lack of account for something that will produce a revolution that does not just loop back on itself. So Daniel, maybe you could elaborate a bit on that. I mean, it was the sort of meat of your talk, so.
Sure. Yeah, I've like all Lacanians, like bashed my head against the wall about some of the aporias and the latent pessimism of Seminar 17. And the irony, of course, is that Lacan would get a following from communists from anarchists, right, who were attending in abundance in his seminars. So even after all of that, I think it's an ambiguity that remains an ambiguity in Lacanian thought. It would obviously take quite a while to piece apart. I don't think, though, at the same time that Lacan is proposing something at the level of what Curtis is proposing. And I actually would invite Isabel and Clint and many and Sydney and others who've done a lot of work on Lacan and politics to also jump in here. I think there's something, I would just say like this. I think that there's something about the insights that Lacan gives us apropos politics and mastery. And I think there's obviously a distinction between mastery and the master there, which we're still trying to tease out. And keep in mind also that it was the Maoists who saw a certain necessity of the master figure for any political formation, who became some of the most patient and important Lacanians, right? I'm thinking of Christian Jambet, I'm thinking of Alain Badiou, right? Who all have taken the Maoist theses on authority and mastery apropos politics and extended them far into the kind of quote unquote post-political situation. So I would actually open up a dialogue with Alain Badiou on this, who's a thinker of the political in a much more rigorous way than Lacan, and who is somebody who, by his own rights, says that I am like extremely faithful to the Lacanian insights, right? So I think in Badiou's later work, we see some of the most refined kind of reformulations of these Maoist problematics, is what I would say. But again, we don't really have the time to tease that out, and I don't want to take too much time, but I invite others to jump in.
Thanks. Isabel, Brett, this idea of the post-political?
Well, in relation to the sort of Lacanian point of, his significance politically and how to use Lacan as a political thinker. I mean, the thing is always that we have to come back to is that even in Seminar 17, Lacan was talking as an analyst, as a psychoanalyst. He wasn't talking as a philosopher or as a political theorist. And when he's talking to the revolutionaries and telling them, sort of slapping on the hands, saying that you'll get a new master, because he's trying to bring the hysterics discourse to the fore to show that what's actually going on here is you're always going to be stuck in this discourse. You're always going to be looking for something else, and in that gesture of rejection, you're invoking another master to come in and tell you something else. So he is always trying to bring in the analyst discourse. He wants to show that this is always going to be there is always going to be a discursive relationship going on, and you have to implicate yourself in it. And what I think is really probably a useful way to think about it is that Lacan comes back to this idea of the analyst being the saint that he talks about in television, in the interview television, and also in relation to James Joyce in Seminar 23 as the saint, or the saint homme, as he calls James Joyce, because the analyst has the position of the saint, in the sense that the saint is the person who in a society tries to take on everybody else's most disgusting, abject outpourings. And how do they do that? They do it by trying to consume their own waste. So like he mentions the saints who eat the shit of a leper, or bathe in the water of a leper, or eat the shit of a sick person. So it's this gesture of having to be aware of how much you are invested in your own suffering. And this is the use value of Lacanian psychoanalysis for politics. It's not that you can necessarily bring a collective together by using psychoanalysis, but you can individually show people how they are always caught in a discourse and caught in a symbolic structure, and via that way then bring people together under the banner of a sort of collective form of suffering, as it were. So yeah, I would say that in a sense, you know, if you want to be corny about it, you could say, well, at least perhaps Curtis can sort of be the saint, you know, in this sense that he's bringing to the fore these the way that we're all kind of like implicated in our own suffering and each other's suffering.
Excellent response, Isabel. Amazing. I know, Clint, you've got your hand up, but I'm just going to give Cindy the floor first. Hi, Cindy. Oh, unmute.
Hi, everyone. And just a fascinating panel and discussion. I feel a little bit inadequate making a comment regarding Adam Curtis's work because I haven't engaged it to the same extent that everyone else seems to have here. But one point has come up again and again, seems to be underpinning all four contributions, and that is this investment in the jouissance of the imagination of power, of power as a particular kind of structure that can be taken up, or a power that can be imagined, or a power that can be enacted, or whatever. And I think one of the things, as a first and foremost, I'm Lacanian, so you know I'm always going to come from that perspective, but I do struggle with the compatibility between psychoanalysis and politics. It isn't one that is necessarily always in sync, and for Lacanians, they do come back to, you know, Lacan's great claim that we should pay more attention to trying to be more interpolated within the analyst's discourse in order to interrogate power as a signifier, which provides a lot of jouissance for us. So for psychoanalysis, the question for me in terms of the viability of psychoanalysis in politics is more around the signifier of politics, or the signifier of the subject that the subject takes up. And that's what psychoanalysis needs to grapple with and handle and problematize and trouble and whatever. So we put the signifier, which is the signifier of politics, to work, because in the unconscious, there, you know, we could say that there isn't any such thing as power. Power is an imaginary form. It's one that we can think about. So we can think politics, we can think power, but for psychoanalysis, which tries to put the unconscious to work and put the signifiers to work, it really is tricky to put these two forms, which for me are quite incompatible, together. And I mean that is the interesting project. So I suppose that's just what I wanted to offer to the discussion, not necessarily relating to Adam Curtis, but certainly it seems as though with Can't Get You Out of My Head, that's what he's trying to do. Imagine a different kind of what power could possibly look like. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. What are the other panelists' thought on this idea? I like this, that power is working here as a signifier that's invested with a jouissance, or working as a fantasy. Brett, what would you think about that?
Well, I mean, I would think about that through the work of Leclerc and Mouffe, actually. I think they spend a lot of time, and in the early work as well as the later work, trying to think through the problem of how subjects identify with or misidentify with particular signifiers, empty signifiers, and so on. And, you know, their argument is essentially that politics consists of subjects identifying with processes of signification or signifiers. So for me, Laclau and Mouffe actually kind of have spent a lot of time working on that very question, actually.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to bring it back to this question of negativity. I think there's a certain tendency which a lot of psychoanalysts and Lacanians still kind of have fidelity to, which still kind of remains a limit point, I would say, of a kind of liberal democratic conception of politics, which is that sort of because we have this certain understanding of the unconscious, of subjectivity, and like Cindy said, even the very category of power is maybe not pessimistically discarded, but is in fact, in a Lacanian sense, kind of a, let's say, a site of impossibility, right? We can't really think about politics qua imaginary, right? There has to be a tethering with the symbolic, and therefore it's very important that the identifications that compose political formations reside on the side outside of being, in some sense, right? Or reside in a kind of civic speech. And this actually is interesting because it also leads to a lot of misunderstandings on behalf of Lacanians apropos identity politics, because I think a lot of people construe Lacan's insights here as necessitating an identification with things like the empty signifier, to use a concept of Laclau and Mouffe, within the context of speech. So there's an additional problem as well, which is a lot of psychoanalytic theories will reduce the question of politics to mere democratic speech, which is why like Miller's school saw the rise of the Front National in France as a threat primarily about free speech, right? Fascism is a threat having to do with the maintenance of free speech and discourse. So I think that this is a blessing and a curse for Lacanians, because politics is actually not reducible to discourse, right? So I think actually Lacanians need to step out of that fetish for the democratic sphere of thinking politics. And this is also why I think Laclau and Mouffe need to be thought beyond. I'm not claiming that I have the formula for that, but I think that the crisis of liberalism today and its decadence and its stultification of norms is readily apparent. I mean, this is one of Curtis's main themes, right? And he's talking about this on all sorts of podcasts right now as well in the wake of this film. So how does psychoanalysis, I'll just pose it as a question, think beyond or confront this crisis of liberalism, you see? So I'm not sure that discourse is the final end. I'll just leave it at that. But.
Thank you. Isabel, did you have any response?
I haven't got anything better to say than that, to be honest.
We'll just go to Clint now, and any other person, raise your hand if you want to speak. I'll put you in the queue. So Clint, you've got the floor.
Oh, thanks, Rosemary. Just to follow up, so let me get my camera on. Just to follow up from, I think it was Daniel talking about Badiou, I was thinking there, but also Isabel on saintliness and so on. I mean, Badiou's Lacan, at least the Lacan that ends up in his seminar on Lacan, is very much the Lacan of the 70s, Lacan of l'Étourdi, Lacan of Lacan of the dissolution, even, which Lee Edelman has been talking about the past couple of years as well. And it's very much the Lacan that's very pessimistic about any kind of social, if we think about how he keeps breaking up with his psychoanalytic associations. I mean, he can't handle the social. I mean, what do Lacanians think of the social? They think of the neighbor. They think of the non-relation. They think of the master and the slave. They think of the analyst and the analysand. So these are always fraught. These are all, and I don't want to ontologize the negative of the non-relation, but they're always these kind of fraught sort of relation, even at the level of the dyad, or whatever the person with the neighbor sort of thing is. And then also to think through, and hopefully I'll come back to Curtis, but I mean, maybe this has to do with his use of the archive when Isabel was talking about his notion of the saint, and that's what Badiou takes up as well in his little book on St. Paul, when he quotes that the letter to the Corinthians, we are the offscourings of the world, you know, the bottom of the shoe in a certain kind of sense. And he says that's what the analyst is. And Lacan's phrase in television is he combines garbage and vanitas and talks about the analyst as trashitas. So whether it's that saint he talks about in Seminar 7 who eats the vomit or eats the shit or the pus off the leper's, why do I have all these signifiers? The pus off the leper's wound, or the trashitas for Lacan, the analyst. And that's the most important position for him, is someone who just receives garbage in a way. And is that the revolutionary? Is that the activist? I mean, in some ways it is. I mean, certainly in terms of my activist friends, they do have that kind of missionary sort of, you know, working with, you know, junkies, working with the homeless and so on. I mean, that's kind of where they are at that sort of political level, but that's not mass politics. That's different as well. So anyway, that's I'll just stop with that because there was kind of political discussions got me thinking a little bit. But thanks very much, everyone. This is really an amazing discussion.
Thanks, Clint. And that activist who is the saintly encounter with the abject is a familiar to me as well, perhaps others too. Any responses to Clint from the panel or the floor even? The room. Daniel, don't worry, I'll export the chat as a file so we'll have the links to. Any responses to this? Oh yes, Elena, you've got your hand up. Yep. Just unmute.
I think there's some like, I don't know if I've really picked this up right, but some like merit in not having just like a discussion of theory or just like activism as like one or the other. Like it's really important to have the both of them together, because if you're not working with people that are also like happy to be working on a similar thing that like you're interested in, then like nothing good is gonna really constructive is gonna come from that. Because if like they're like, hey, why don't we do this thing? And they're like, yeah, I hate this. Like it's gonna suck in the end, and like what emerges could be like way worse than what the intention was for. And also I'm just like curious for the people that are talking, like what sort of like where do they like stand like politically, or like what are they like working on at the moment? That's it for me.
Thanks, Elena. That's a really good point about praxis, I guess, that we don't want to sort of have this idea that theory, as with a capital T, is somehow the inverse of politics, though there is some tension there, I think, that Cindy was pointing to. Just to answer your final ask about what we're doing, I suppose, well, I'm an academic in New Zealand. But I go to a recent article by Anna Kornblue, which is called Extinct Critique, talks about the role of the academic in, I guess, radical politics in the current university system. And she has 4 norms, I think she puts at the end. And one of them is, of course, partly teaching and doing the work of a teacher that works to build some sort of consciousness in the students. And I think Brett mentioned, and myself too, these films by Adam Curtis can help with that, but also to organise collectively within your workplace. So being myself, answering your question, Elena, I guess being active in the union is a major factor, but primarily I see myself as an academic. I guess Brett, Daniel, Isabel, perhaps replying to Elena.
Well, I mean, it's a similar sort of story for me. I work in the University of Otago in New Zealand. I was actually the branch president there for a while of the Tertiary Education Union branch, which was an interesting experience. So, you know, we sort of get involved in a bit of workplace activism, particularly around, I mean, the general term for it is the I don't know how good it is, the neoliberalisation of the university. And so we've been involved in quite a few things to push back against that. So really, you know, I see that kind of activism as really important because it's defence of, you know, education.
And also going back to that question of public intellectualism, I think we have a role as intellectuals to have, or academics, to do something with our work that has a public good, maybe. Anyway, I think Adam Curtis functions as a public intellectual too. Daniel, do you have a response to Elena?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say I was critical on Curtis only because I'm among friends. I actually respect his work a lot, and I've taught it a lot too. So yeah, props to what he's doing and so on. And it's, you know, it would be nice if there were more people that inhabit it. And I think even a follow-up question of, you know, what are the precise conditions that enable Adam Curtis to occupy this authority voice is an interesting thing that we've kind of touched on, but needs more thinking. But yeah, right now I teach adjunct, but I'm also, during pandemic conditions, I've opened up a kind of free study group in Lacanian psychoanalysis and Marxism. It's torsion groups, if you look at it on Twitter, and we've had some great seminars, bringing in a lot of kind of senior Lacanian scholars and senior Marxist scholars, and that work just allowed me to do kind of a lot of good research as well. So I have an article coming out tomorrow on the lumpen proletariat in contemporary Marxist thought, and just continuing to work on a number of things actually related to psychoanalysis and politics for research. I do some filmmaking myself for PBS as well, in order to have a family and pay the bills. So, you know, kind of doing that. But then on activism, I mean, look, it comes in many forms. I think art is an incredible vehicle in so many myriad ways. So I don't know what specific we're invited to comment on that, but I think I would also say even the very term activist, be an activist, sometimes participates in that kind of false conflation of there are activists and thinkers. And I'm not suggesting that you think that, but I think that we need to abandon that itself. Because like tonight, all the thinking that's gone on here, I think many people are going to walk away from this with all these ideas of things that they're writing and they're researching and is going to inform their politics too. So it's all intertwined, is what I would say.
Agreed.
So yeah, to your first point about sort of theory and praxis, I think that was your question. I mean, I think this is really, well, one of the things that I sort of touched upon was the problem with how to disseminate theoretical ideas into popular culture, and how do you make the bridge between all of these conversations that as academics we have, and all these papers we write, and all these books we write, and all these conferences we go to, what difference does it make in the world? And a lot of the time you feel like, well, it doesn't make any difference, because all we're doing really is having conversations between ourselves. And then sometimes there's this little kind of green shoot that like pokes through and goes out into the world. Like, for example, this is, I think, quite a rare instance where we're talking about a popular culture object that somehow straddles both, in some ways, high theory and mainstream media, and these things are really rare, and they're very important and really wonderful when they happen. I think more cynically, I would say that I, as an academic person who's just finished my PhD, and I'm just about to, publishing my first book, and then it's always exciting because now I'm an academic. But at the same time, for us in academia, we are in quite a dire situation because our work is not monetarily valued. We don't get paid for anything that we do unless we're in a university position, when unless we have tenure, unless we have teaching, we don't get paid. We talk at places, we write for things, we do reviews, we're constantly working, but we can't support ourselves financially most of the time unless we teach or are sort of administrators in universities. And that is terrible, because we are supposedly creating and contributing to culture and producing knowledge all the time, and we work really hard. Everybody here I know does, and it's like, not to turn this into a moan, but like, I think it's a really important point about theory and praxis, because how do we continue to have enthusiasm and care about this sort of thing if, like, now for the generation coming up, I'm just starting in, like, supposedly the world of academia, and yeah, it's like, how does society value that kind of work? If it's not financially viable, it will stop. There won't be any more people doing PhDs. No one's going to be able to afford to do a PhD. No one's going to be able to afford to have these conversations. And so I think that this is a really important political point about, it's not just the problem of academics being up their own asses in their own little worlds talking about theory that nobody else understands. It's the problem of, if literally people can't, like, make a living, then they're going to stop doing it. And that's what they've created, is a world where very few people have the luxury to be able to do stuff like this and to be able to put themselves through a PhD and then go on and like make a living. And we need to make sure that there are more things like Adam Curtis's documentary that makes people go, oh, there's all these exciting ideas, and how do I engage with them? What books can I read? How do I start thinking? And thinking needs to be a thing again that everybody does. So that would be my kind of like plea for theory and praxis together, I suppose.
I absolutely agree, Isabel, for sure. This is a vital conversation. I'm going to actually wind up. Apologies, Jack. But what I want to do is, I want to say these kinds of events are really important. I mean, is it an event? I'm not sure. But these kinds of getting together globally and talking about ideas, I found it incredibly enlivening to hear the fellow panelists, but also the discussion from our respondents in the Zoom room and the chat. Again, I'll be exporting the chat and uploading the file to YouTube. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank Brett, Daniel and Isabel for really engaged, alive, critical and thoughtful presentations and responses to Curtis's film. And I'll end also just re-going some plugs. So Isabel's book about psychoanalysis and AI is forthcoming very soon with Palgrave Lacan series. Daniel has a number of ventures. Torsion Groups is torsion_groups on Twitter. And Daniel also has a vital podcast called Jouissance Vampires. So please check that out. And also you have a book coming out that I read out in the bio, Theologies and Ethics and Justice in Islam. So please check that out. Brett, I've put his article in the chat again from Borderlands on Adam Curtis. Our program, Media, Film and Communications, are hoping to host more of these events. So please keep your eyes on your email for things like this coming up. Also another plug, Matisse, Jack and I and some of the, Sarah I think's in the room, are working on a collection, an art book called New Models, which tackles broadly some of these ideas and contemporary conjunctures. And this question Elena brought up between politics and praxis, and that should be coming out, when do we think? Late March? Jack's nodding, yeah, maybe April. Okay, so New Models Codex, that's it. So thank you again, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you again sometime in the Zoom room, if not in person. So ciao for now. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Rosie. Bye.
Bye.